Hello everyone, my name is Father Joe and I'm a priest of the Diocese of Reno. I'm currently assigned out in Elko and I also happen to be Mrs. Walsh's oldest brother. And she asked me to give a little bit of reflection on what is known as the fourth cup theory. I'm going to get into that in a second. But I find that to be very useful for understanding what we are doing these next couple of days. What is happening during the Triduum, specifically what is happening at Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and then Easter Sunday. I'm hoping to make this about 15 minutes, and I'm going to break it up into three different sections. The first one is going to be looking at the Old Testament, seeing how it prepares us for what's going to be happening with Christ at the Last Supper. Then I want to transition and look at what is actually happening in the Last Supper, and what is this mysterious cup that Christ asked that might pass from him. And then third and finally, I want to talk about why that matters to us, specifically when we are celebrating the great sacrifice of the Mass, when we are celebrating the Divine Liturgy. And that brings us to the Old Testament. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, when Christ appeared on the scene in first century Palestine, it wasn't as though he was speaking out into a vacuum. It wasn't as though he was addressing people who did not know God. Rather, for centuries, for millennia, God had been working with the people of Israel, had been teaching them, had been helping them, and had been preparing them. And so when Christ is speaking, it's not as though he is taking this out of nowhere. Rather, he reaffirms a lot of what has come before. One of the most famous things that Jesus said was, "You shall love your neighbor as you love yourself." But that actually doesn't start with Jesus. You can find that in Leviticus chapter 19. So Jesus is reaffirming a lot of what is happening. He is taking what the people already know, what God has already revealed to them, and is taking them further. He's not going against what has come before. He's leading it to fulfillment. And I want to emphasize this, because if we're going to understand something, we have to understand the context from which it arises. This actually reminds me of a teacher back when I was at Manogue, Mrs. Floria. She was an English teacher, and she loved to say whenever we messed up a quote, "A text without a context is a pretext for a proof text." What she meant by that is, if you take something and don't show where it is coming from, you don't show what it arises from, you can bend it, make it say anything that you would like. But if you truly want to understand what something is saying, you have to look at what is around that. You have to look at the text that surrounds it. You have to look at the context from which it arises. And the same is true for Christ. If we want to understand Christ, we have to look at the historical context. We have to look at what was going on at that time. Perhaps a silly example might further illuminate my point. Let's imagine for a second that you really, really love Marvel superhero movies, right? And you have a friend who has never seen a single movie. Now, as we all know, the best movie out of all of those is Avengers Infinity War. However, even though that one is the best, you wouldn't show that movie to your friend first. Because if you tried to show them that without the context of all the other movies, they wouldn't fully grasp what's going on. They wouldn't understand the emotional turmoil that Star-Lord's going through. They wouldn't understand Doctor Strange's great prediction. You have to understand the context of what's going on. So you'd start them back at the other movies to prepare them for this movie. And the same is true for Christ. Christ is arising from historical context. And we have to understand the Old Testament. We have to understand the cultural milieu of the time in order to understand Christ. And so a lot of the early church fathers, when there were some people that were arising saying we don't need the Old Testament anymore, were fond of saying that the Old Testament gives light to the New, and the New Testament is hidden within the Old. That these two things are inextricably bound. This is particularly important for understanding the Last Supper, because it happens in the context of the Passover meal. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of history here, but you probably know a lot of this already, so I think we're okay with there. But the first Passover is celebrated in Exodus chapter 12 and 13. There's the people are enslaved in Egypt. Pharaoh refuses to let them go. There's the 10 plagues. And finally, God tells Moses that the people are to partake of a sacrificial banquet in which they sacrifice a lamb, they eat of the lamb, and then they anoint the doorposts and the lintel of the house. And through this sacrificial meal, the people are saved and ultimately are led out of their slavery into the promised land. That's going to be something that takes a long time. But this is the definitive moment in which the people are freed from their slavery. And so, fast forward a little bit, in Numbers, I believe it's chapter 28, God then tells Moses that every year they are to celebrate this great feast. Every year they are supposed to participate in the great Passover of God. Every year this Passover is made present again to the people. Now, the scriptures don't tell us exactly how this was celebrated. However, we do have some texts from the 2nd century called the Mishnah that are a compilation of rabbinical teachings that show us kind of what would have been the practice back in the 1st century. And if you want to go further into this, it's Mishnah. It looks specifically at Pesachim, paragraph 10, that talks about how they would celebrate the Passover. What did that meal look like? And the answer is, it looked a lot like the modern day Seder meals that we have today, specifically within the Jewish community, within the Jewish celebration. It looked very, very similar. And so this great rite has been going on for about 2 millennia at least. And so Christ, when he is celebrating the Passover meal, he's celebrating a Seder meal. Now, there is a lot of things that happen in the Seder meal. I'm not going to go into all of them. But the important things I want you guys to take away from this is that in the Seder meal, there was this great moment in which the youngest person would ask the eldest, what makes this night different than any other night? The second thing I want you to take away from this is that in this celebration, there were 4 chalices. There was 4 cups of wine that would be drunk throughout the rite. And the third thing I want to point out is that there was a hallel. There was a singing of praise to God. It was some of the psalms would be sung at that time. And all of this gives us the historical context in which we can then look upon what Jesus was doing at the Last Supper. And that brings me to the second thing that I want to talk about, namely how looking at the Lord's Supper through the context of the Passover sacrifice and the Passover meal can help us understand what is going on. Now, I do want to begin with a bit of a disclaimer. This is somewhat of a debated theological point among scholars. A lot of modern scholars will make the argument that Jesus' Last Supper was not a Seder meal, or was not a Passover meal. And the main argument that I've been able to find is that there is a lot of key details that are omitted. For example, there is no lamb of sacrifice mentioned. There's no bitter herbs mentioned. There's no waiting for Elijah. And so some scholars will say that this is not supposed to be interpreted as a Passover meal. I, however, don't find this to be compelling. And I have 5 reasons for that. The first is that the gospel narratives of this very clearly indicate that this was a Passover meal. Jesus sends the apostles, and the apostles go and prepare for the Passover meal. The second thing is, for millennia, the church has been interpreting this as a Passover meal. Third, the church fathers will spend a lot of time talking about why this is important. If you want to go more in depth in this, I would recommend St. Thomas Aquinas' Catena Aurea, specifically on the Last Supper narratives. The fourth thing I want to point out is that there are details that do correspond with a Seder meal. For example, the mention of multiple chalices, as well as the hallel that will be sung. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then finally, and probably most importantly out of everything, Jesus himself says that I much desire to celebrate this Passover meal with you. And so if Jesus is saying that this is a Passover meal, we should be looking at this as though it were a Passover meal, as though it were a Seder. So that gets us to what's going on now. That Jesus' Last Supper should be interpreted as a Passover meal. Now, I'm going to go into why this is important, but I want to start with a bit of a story. Mrs. Walsh and myself both went to Franciscan University of Steubenville, Ohio. And there is a famous biblical scholar named Dr. Scott Hahn. Now, Dr. Scott Hahn is a convert to Catholicism. And when he was in seminary, a Protestant seminary, one of his professors asked the question. They were talking about the Garden of Gethsemane, specifically the section where Jesus says in the Synoptic Gospels, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. And the professor asked them, what do you think that this cup is? What is this thing referencing? And there was somewhat of a debate among the students. The professor gave his interpretation, but Dr. Hom was not ultimately satisfied. He then began to enter more deeply into this question. Answering this question actually led him to writing a book called The Fourth Cup. I would highly recommend it. I'm going to be stealing a lot of ideas from this. But at the end of it, he made the argument that if we were to understand why Jesus says, let this cup pass from me, we have to look at what was going on in the meal. And specifically, he points to the 4 chalices that would have been present in the Seder meal. The first one is the chalice in which there is the blessing over the world and over the chalice, which that's not super important. In the Gospel of Luke, we do see that multiple chalices are made referenced to. The chalice that I want to focus on, chalices that I want to focus on, are the 3rd and the 4th. The 3rd chalice was called the chalice of blessing. And it is somewhat interesting because if we look at the Gospel of Luke closely, it seems as though this is the chalice that Jesus picks up and says, take this, all of you, and drink from it, for this is the chalice of my blood. Further reference to this, St. Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians says, is not the chalice that we bless a participation in the blood of Christ? The chalice that we bless, this 3rd chalice being the chalice of blessing, which is somewhat odd that Jesus kind of goes off script at this point, instituting the sacrament of the Eucharist. He does go off script. But then he says, I will not drink again from this cup until all things are come to fulfillment. Then in the Gospel of Matthew, and as well as Mark, if memory serves, it says that they sang a hymn and then they went off into the Mount of Olives. And then Jesus says, let this, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. I find this to be interesting because if we look at this from the context of the Seder meal, Jesus has started it. He has been celebrating it, and then out of nowhere, he goes off script. He changes what's going on and takes the chalice of blessing and says, this is my blood. And then they sing a hymn, which is near the end of the Seder rite, but they never actually get to the 4th chalice. And Jesus specifically says he will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until all things are brought to completion. So it's as though Jesus left without the conclusion. It's like, imagine one of your friends having a conversation with you, and then right before it's coming to the end of that conversation, instead of saying goodbye, they just turn and walk away. It's like, it would be really, really bizarre. It would be really, really jarring if we were to look at this from the perspective of someone who knew the Seder meal. However, Dr. Scott Hom makes the argument that it's not as though the Seder meal has ended, but rather Jesus is continuing this Seder meal, but what was being done in symbol is now being brought into reality. What was being done beforehand as the celebration of the deliverance of the people of Israel by God is now being brought to fulfillment. And so when Jesus leaves, he hasn't finished the supper. Rather, he is awaiting the 4th cup, the cup of consummation, the cup of fulfillment, the last chalice that will be drank during the Seder meal. And then he goes forth and he suffers and he dies. And Dr. Scott Hom makes the argument that it is the crucifixion of Christ that is the fulfillment of it. Because we even see referenced while Jesus is on the cross, one of the bystanders takes some wine and brings it up to the lips of Jesus. That this is the 4th cup. This is the culmination of the Seder meal. And I think that's really, really important to remember, because if we look at it this way, the Last Supper as well as the Passion of Christ are not 2 different things, but they are one continuous rite. They are one continuous action of Christ. And this then helps us understand what it means for Christ to have a sacrifice. You see, Benedict XVI made the comment that the words of Jesus at the Last Supper, if they did not have the crucifixion, would simply be empty ritual. And then Dr. Scon has made the argument that if you just have the crucifixion without the words, all you have is a Roman execution. You don't have a sacrifice. So it would seem to me that if you were looking at this from the perspective of a first century Jew, and you did not see this in the context of a Seder meal, you would see Jesus going off script first, and then you would see a Roman execution. You would not see a sacrifice. Because remember, for the sacrifice to occur, it has to happen within the temple, it has to happen with the priests, that has to be offered up to God. But if you were to take this as one continuous action, if you were to take the crucifixion of Jesus as the continuation of the Seder meal, these things are brought together. These things are intimately united. And so Jesus' offering of himself in the upper room is brought to completion on the cross. And the cross, which even in the Latin, we would read that when the last word that Jesus says, "it is finished," in Latin is consummatum est. It is accomplished, or it is consummated. Remember, the last chalice of the Seder meal was the cup of consummation. All of these things are brought into one thing. The sacrifice of Christ and the offering of his body are united. Christ is the great high priest offering the sacrifice, and the sacrifice is made at Calvary when he is truly the victim. Bringing these things together, bringing the action into one ritual action that is bringing to fulfillment what happened at the original Passover. And that brings me to the third thing that I want to talk about, namely why this is important for us. You might have remembered earlier I made reference to the question that the youngest person would ask at the Seder meal. Why is this night different than any other night? Now, different scholars will have different interpretation of this, but the interpretation that I found to be the most helpful is that when the child asks this question, they aren't simply talking about this night, but they are talking about the moments of the first Passover. That spiritually, those that partake of the Seder meal are brought back to the liberation of the people of Israel from their servitude and slavery within Egypt. And some of the symbols that are used help emphasize this as well. You have the bitter herbs to remind them of the bitterness of the slavery in Egypt. Sure, that the people themselves are not enslaved, but they are spiritually entering into that moment with the people of Israel. They recline on pillows, reminding themselves that once they were slaves, but now they are free and able to enter into this comfort. They are entering spiritually into the salvation that God accomplished millennia ago. And the same is true at our supper. The same is true upon this altar. Within Catholic theology, we say that the Eucharistic sacrifice makes present the sacrifice of Christ to us, and we to it. We are brought into that upper room. We are brought into the Last Supper. We are with the disciples, sitting there and receiving from Jesus the bread and the wine, which become his body and his blood. What happened 2,000 years ago isn't simply encapsulated within that time, but rather we are made present to it as well. And upon this altar, we enter into the death and resurrection of Jesus. We enter into Holy Thursday. We enter into that Seder meal which is accomplished at Good Friday, but that ultimately leads to Easter Sunday, to the resurrection. We are brought spiritually into this. We are made disciples of Jesus sitting in that upper room. We are made present to this mystery. And that's why we celebrate it. That's why we celebrate it every day, except for Good Friday and Holy Saturday. Because when we celebrate these liturgies, the liturgy is one large moment. You might have noticed this if you've ever been to Mass on Good Friday or Holy Saturday. But at Good Friday, we don't actually celebrate the Mass. And on Holy Saturday, we don't do anything until the Vigil, which is the first moment of Easter itself. And the reason why we do this is because starting at Holy Thursday and until the Easter Vigil, all of this is one liturgical event. All of these things are brought into union. That there isn't a separation and division between what happens on Holy Thursday, what happens on Good Friday, and what happens on Easter Sunday. All of these are seen to be one moment, one liturgy, one rite in which we enter into the body of Christ. We offer ourselves with Christ, and we rise with him at Easter Sunday. I know I went through a lot of deep theology today, and I understand it can be very difficult to wrap our heads around. But hopefully this is helpful for understanding what we are going to be doing these next couple of days. And hopefully you all are able to enter into this liturgy, if not physically present, at least spiritually. And with that, I'm going to end my reflection. Stay safe, all of you, and may God bless and keep you.